Jake Morrison floated in his escape pod and watched his transport ship burn in the cold darkness of space. The explosion had been quick and brutal, leaving him as one of only 3 survivors from a crew of 40. His hands shook as he checked the pod's navigation system and found what he already knew. He was far from any human colony. Drifting toward a neutral trading station called Kepler 7, the pod's radio crackled to life, with dozens of distress calls from other ships that had been caught in the same ambush. The Vex Empire had struck without warning, targeting anything that moved through this sector. Jake had been heading home after 6 months of fighting on the Rim worlds, but now he was just another refugee looking for shelter. Kepler-7 grew larger in his viewport as the pod's emergency thrusters pushed him toward the docking bay. The station was massive, built from salvaged ship parts and mining equipment that had been welded together over decades. It spun slowly to create artificial gravity, and Jake could see dozens of other escape pods and damaged ships waiting to dock. The docking process took hours because so many vessels needed help at the same time. When Jake finally stepped out of his pod, he was hit by the smell of too many beings crammed into too small a space. The docking bay was packed with refugees from at least 10 different species, all talking at once in their various languages and dialects. Jake kept his military uniform hidden under a civilian jacket he had grabbed from his pod's emergency kit. Being a human soldier would draw attention he could not afford, especially if Vex agents were already on the station looking for survivors to capture or kill. He claimed to be a cargo handler named Jake Miller when the station's processing clerk asked for his identification. The clerk was a tired-looking woman with short gray hair, who had clearly been working without sleep for days. She barely looked at his fake papers before stamping them and pointing toward a long line of beings waiting for room assignments. Jake took his place behind a tall blue-skinned alien who smelled like ozone and electricity. The wait gave him time to study the other refugees and plan his next move. Most were civilians who had been caught in the wrong place when the Vex attacked, but Jake spotted at least 3 other military personnel trying to blend in with the crowd. None of them were human, which made him feel even more alone and exposed. When his turn finally came, the housing administrator looked even more exhausted than the clerk. She was an older human woman with kind eyes who clearly hated giving people bad news. She explained that the station was at 3 times its normal capacity and that private rooms were impossible to find. Jake was about to ask about sleeping in the cargo holds when the woman behind him in line stepped forward and spoke in accented but perfect English. She was unlike any alien Jake had seen before, with pale skin that seemed to shimmer slightly and hair that looked like spun silver. Her eyes were a deep purple color that seemed to shift and change as she moved. She told the administrator that she was also looking for accommodation and would be willing to share a room if it meant avoiding the overcrowded refugee shelters. The administrator looked relieved and quickly found the only available space, a small maintenance room on level 7 that had been converted into emergency housing. Jake wanted to object but knew he had no choice. The shelters were dangerous, places where fights broke out regularly and where Vex agents could easily find targets. A shared room with one alien was better than sleeping in the open with hundreds of desperate refugees. The administrator handed them both key cards and directions to their new home. Jake grabbed his small bag of belongings and followed the silver-haired woman toward the lifts. She moved with a grace that suggested either military training or royal upbringing, but her clothes were simple and practical like those of a merchant or trader. They rode the lift in silence, both studying each other without being obvious about it. Jake noticed that she carried herself like someone used to being in charge, while she seemed puzzled by his calm acceptance of their shared situation. Most humans she had encountered were either overly friendly or openly hostile toward non-humans. Level 7 was one of the station's maintenance areas, with narrow corridors lined with pipes and electrical conduits. Their room was at the end of a dead-end hallway, which Jake appreciated from a security standpoint, but which made the space feel even more cramped and isolated. The room itself was barely large, enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time. There was a single narrow bed built into one wall, a tiny desk with 2 chairs, and a bathroom so small that Jake wondered how he would fit inside it. A small viewport showed the stars spinning slowly as the station rotated. The woman set her bag on the desk and turned to face him with her arms crossed. She introduced herself as Lyra and explained that she was a crystal merchant traveling from the outer systems when the attacks began. Her story sounded reasonable, but Jake noticed that her bag was made from expensive materials and that her clothes, while simple, were perfectly tailored. Jake gave his cover story about being a cargo handler, but he could tell from her expression that she was not entirely convinced. She had the same look that intelligence officers got when they were trying to decide if someone was lying to them. He made a mental note to be more careful around her. They established basic rules for sharing the space. Jake would sleep on the floor while Lyra took the bed, and they would take turns using the bathroom and the small food preparation area. Neither of them was happy with the arrangement, but both knew it was temporary until better options became available. As the station's night cycle began and the lights dimmed, Jake lay on the hard floor with his jacket as a pillow and listened to Lyra moving quietly around the room. He had shared worse accommodations during his military service, but never with someone he trusted so little. Something about her did not match her story, and Jake had learned to trust his instincts about such things. Lyra seemed to be having similar thoughts as she lay in the narrow bed above him. She had caught the way he had surveyed the room when they first entered, checking sight lines and potential escape routes like a trained soldier would. His hands also bore small scars that looked like they came from weapons training rather than cargo handling. Both of them fell asleep, wondering what secrets the other was hiding, and whether those secrets would get them both killed. Jake woke to the sound of heavy boots in the corridor outside their room. His military training kicked in immediately, and he rolled silently off the floor to crouch beside the door. The footsteps were too organized and purposeful to belong to regular station personnel or refugees. Lyra was already awake and sitting up in bed, her purple eyes wide with concern. She had heard the same sounds and reached the same conclusion. These were not friendly visitors. Jake held up his hand for silence and pressed his ear to the door. 3 sets of boots stopped just outside their room, and Jake heard the distinctive whine of energy weapons being charged. Vex hunters had found the station and were conducting room-to-room searches. Jake cursed silently and looked around for anything they could use as weapons or tools. Lyra slipped out of bed and moved to the small viewport, peering carefully around the edge to see if there were ships docked outside. She whispered that she could see at least 2 Vex assault vessels attached to the station's hull, which meant they were dealing with a full boarding party rather than a few infiltrators. The searchers moved to the next room, and Jake heard muffled voices followed by the sound of someone being dragged away. Whatever they were looking for, they were being thorough about it. Jake realized that his fake identity would not hold up under close examination, especially if they had military scanners. Lyra grabbed her bag and pulled out what looked like a standard data pad, but when she touched the surface, it lit up with symbols and patterns that Jake had never seen before. She worked quickly and quietly, her fingers dancing over the display with practiced ease. After a few moments, she showed him a schematic of the station's maintenance tunnels. Jake was impressed despite himself. Getting access to those plans required either high-level clearance or very expensive illegal software. He was about to ask how a simple crystal merchant had obtained such tools when the footsteps returned to their corridor. This time the hunters were checking every room methodically, and Jake could hear doors being forced open and belongings being searched. They had maybe 2 minutes before the searchers reached their door, and the maintenance tunnels were their only option for escape. Lyra pointed to a ventilation grate near the ceiling that connected to the tunnel system. Jake boosted her up first, noting that she moved with the agility of someone who had done this before. She disappeared into the narrow space, and then reached down to help pull him up after her. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person to crawl through, and the metal was cold against their skin. They could hear the hunters enter their room just as they sealed the grate behind them. Angry voices echoed through the walls as the searchers realized their targets had escaped. Lyra led the way through the tunnel system, following a path that seemed to make no sense to Jake until he realized she was avoiding the main junction points, where they might encounter maintenance workers or security cameras. Her navigation was too precise to be based on the datapad alone, which meant she had either studied the station extensively or had been here before. They emerged from the tunnels in a storage area 3 levels down from their room. Jake helped Lyra down from the ceiling access panel and noticed that she was breathing hard and looked pale. The stress of their escape was taking its toll, and he realized that, despite her apparent experience with covert movement, she was not used to this level of physical exertion. Jake found a medical kit in the storage area and convinced Lyra to let him check her hands, which had been cut by the rough edges of the tunnel walls. As he cleaned and bandaged the wounds, he was surprised by how gentle his touch became. Her skin was softer than human skin but warmer, and he could feel a faint electrical current running beneath the surface. Lyra was equally surprised by his careful attention to her injuries. Most humans she had encountered treated aliens as either curiosities or threats, but Jake was tending to her wounds with the same care he would show to one of his own people. She found herself studying his face as he worked and noting the intelligence in his dark brown eyes. When Jake finished with the bandages, Lyra quietly thanked him and asked how he had known to check the corridor for threats. She had noticed his immediate response to danger and his knowledge of tactics that seemed far beyond what a cargo handler would need. Jake realized he had revealed too much of his military background, but decided that partial honesty was better than a complete lie. He told her that he had served in the colonial militia before becoming a traitor, which explained his combat awareness without revealing his current military status. Lyra nodded but did not seem entirely convinced. She had her own secrets to protect, but she was beginning to think that Jake might be more trustworthy than she had initially assumed. His willingness to help her escape and his gentle treatment of her injuries suggested that he was not the typical human supremacist that many of her people warned against. They spent the next several hours hiding in the storage area while Vex patrols searched the station. Jake used his military knowledge to predict patrol patterns and timing, while Lyra accessed station systems through her datapad to monitor their movements. Their combined skills kept them one step ahead of capture, but both knew they could not hide forever. During a quiet moment between patrols, Lyra asked Jake about his experiences with other alien species. She was curious about human attitudes toward non-humans and whether the stories of human aggression and intolerance were accurate. Jake was honest about the prejudice that existed, but explained that many humans were trying to build better relationships with their galactic neighbors. Jake asked Lyra similar questions about her people's views on humanity. She admitted that most of her species considered humans to be primitive and dangerous, more interested in conquest than cooperation. However, her recent experiences were making her reconsider some of those assumptions. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of energy weapons fire from somewhere else on the station. The Vex were not just searching anymore, they were fighting station security and anyone who resisted their presence. Jake and Lyra realized that staying on the station was becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. Lyra pulled up the docking bay schematics on her datapad and pointed out several small courier ships that might be suitable for escape. The problem was that the docking bay was heavily guarded, and neither of them had proper clearance to board civilian vessels. Jake suggested that they needed to create a distraction that would draw the guards away from the ships. He had noticed several fuel storage tanks near the docking bay that could be rigged to explode without causing major structural damage to the station. The explosion would create enough chaos for them to steal a ship and escape. Lyra was impressed by his tactical thinking but worried about the risk to innocent people on the station. Jake assured her that he could time the explosion to avoid casualties while still providing the cover they needed. As they prepared to leave their hiding place and make their way toward the docking bay, both Jake and Lyra realized that they were placing their lives in each other's hands. The trust that was building between them was fragile but real, based on shared danger and mutual respect rather than species, loyalty, or political alliance. Jake gathered the supplies they would need to create their distraction while Lyra programmed their escape route into her datapad. Neither spoke about what would happen after they escaped the station, but both knew that their partnership had become something more than just convenient cooperation. They were no longer just two strangers forced to share a room. They were allies who had chosen to trust each other despite every reason to remain suspicious and distant. The station's alarm system wailed through the corridors as Jake and Lyra made their way back toward Level 7. Their plan to reach the docking bay had failed when they discovered that Vex forces had sealed off all the main routes and were using advanced scanners that could detect movement through walls. Their only option was to return to their small room and wait for the search to pass. The journey back through the maintenance tunnels was harder than before, because station security was now checking every access point and ventilation shaft. They had to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for their bodies, and twice they were forced to remain motionless for over an hour while search teams passed just meters away from their hiding spots. When they finally reached their room, both were exhausted and covered in dust and grease from the tunnel system. Jake checked the corridor carefully before opening the door, but the hunters had moved on to other sections of the station. Their small space felt like a sanctuary after hours of cramped hiding places and constant fear of discovery. Lyra collapsed onto the narrow bed without bothering to remove her dirty clothes. Her silver hair was tangled with debris, and her hands were shaking from exhaustion and stress. Jake could see that she was reaching the limits of her endurance, but he also noticed that she had never complained or asked to rest during their escape attempts. The station's communication system crackled to life with an announcement that all residents must remain in their quarters until further notice. Anyone found in the corridors would be detained for questioning by Vex security forces. Jake realized that they were now trapped in their tiny room with no way to know how long the lockdown would last. Jake sat on the floor and leaned against the wall, trying to process everything that had happened in the last day. He had gone from being a soldier heading home to being a refugee hiding from enemy forces with an alien woman who clearly knew more about covert operations than any merchant should. The situation was beyond anything his military training had prepared him for. Lyra watched Jake from the bed and saw the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes constantly moved to check the door and viewport. She had been trained to read body language and recognize the signs of someone carrying a heavy burden of responsibility. Whatever his real identity, he was clearly more than just a former militia member. The forced proximity of their situation made conversation almost unavoidable, and both realized they needed to know more about each other if they were going to survive. Jake started by telling her about his childhood on New Montana, one of the newer human colony worlds where life was hard but people looked out for each other. He described how his parents had been among the first settlers, building their farm from nothing and teaching their children the value of hard work and determination. Jake explained that humans had to be tough and adaptable because they were newcomers to a galaxy full of older and more advanced species who did not always welcome their expansion. Lyra listened carefully and began to understand why humans had developed their reputation for stubbornness and aggression. From Jake's description, his people were not conquerors but survivors who had learned to fight for everything they achieved. She found herself admiring their persistence even if she did not agree with all their methods. When Jake asked about her background, Lyra chose her words carefully but shared more than she had intended. She spoke about her homeworld and its crystal cities that grew from the ground like living things. She described how her people were connected to technology in ways that other species found mysterious, able to interface with machines through touch and thought. Jake was fascinated by her explanations of Zolani culture and their relationship with what they called living metal. He had heard rumors about alien species who could control technology directly, but he had never met anyone who actually possessed such abilities. The way Lyra's eyes lit up when she talked about crystal singing and harmonic engineering made him realize how much she missed her home. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor outside. Heavy footsteps and angry voices indicated that the Vex were conducting another search, this time checking the rooms they had already cleared. Jake grabbed his jacket and prepared to hide in the bathroom, but Lyra stopped him with a gesture. She closed her eyes and placed her hands flat against the wall, her face tightening with concentration. The metal beneath her palms began to hum very softly, and Jake felt a strange, tingling sensation in the air around them. After a few moments, the footsteps in the corridor seemed to fade and move away from their door. Jake stared at Lyra in amazement as she opened her eyes and slumped forward with exhaustion. She had somehow masked their presence from the searchers, but the effort had clearly cost her considerable energy. Her skin was pale and damp with sweat, and she was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Without thinking, Jake moved to sit beside her on the bed and placed his arm around her shoulders to steady her. The physical contact created an immediate connection between them that neither had expected. Jake could feel the electrical current that ran beneath her skin, while Lyra sensed the steady strength and warmth of his human physiology. The moment stretched between them as they both realized that something had changed in their relationship. What had started as forced cooperation was becoming something deeper and more personal. Jake found himself studying the curve of Lyra's face and the way her silver hair caught the light from their room's small lamp. Lyra was equally aware of Jake's closeness and the protective way he held her. She had never been this near to a human before, and she was surprised by how natural it felt. His presence was calming rather than threatening, and she found herself wanting to lean into his strength rather than pull away from it. The intimacy of the moment was broken when Lyra began to shiver from the aftereffects of using her abilities. Jake helped her lie down on the bed and covered her with the thin blanket provided by the station. She tried to protest that he needed rest too, but he insisted that she recover from her exertion first. As the station's night cycle began and the lights dimmed to their lowest setting, Jake found himself sharing the narrow bed with Lyra out of necessity rather than choice. The space was so small that they had to lie very close together, and both were acutely aware of the other's presence and breathing. Jake lay on his back staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about how Lyra's body felt pressed against his side. Her alien nature should have made the situation uncomfortable, but instead he found her presence soothing and familiar. The soft sound of her breathing and the faint electrical hum from her skin created a rhythm that helped him relax. Lyra rested her head on Jake's shoulder and marveled at how safe she felt despite their dangerous situation. She had been taught that humans were unpredictable and violent, but Jake had shown her nothing but kindness and protection. His steady heartbeat beneath her ear was reassuring, and she allowed herself to trust him completely for the first time. In the quiet darkness of their shared space, both Jake and Lyra realized that they were no longer hiding just their identities from each other. They were also hiding their growing feelings and the knowledge that their connection was becoming something that could complicate everything they thought they knew about their respective species. The secret they shared was no longer just about survival. It was about the possibility that two people from different worlds could find understanding and affection, despite everything that should have kept them apart. Jake woke to find Lyra sitting at the small desk, her face illuminated by the glow from her datapad. The station was still under lockdown, but she had managed to access the communication networks and was reading messages that made her expression grow more worried with each passing minute. She turned to face him and delivered news that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Intelligence reports were circulating through both human and Zilani networks claiming that Sergeant Jake Morrison had been captured by alien forces, while Princess Lyra of the Zilani Empire was reportedly being held prisoner by human military units. Jake sat up quickly, his mind racing as he realized the implications. Someone was spreading false information about both of them, which meant they were not only being hunted by the Vex, but also by their own people who believed they had been captured or turned traitor. The room suddenly felt even smaller and more like a trap than a shelter. Lyra confirmed his fears by showing him the bounty notices that had been posted on several networks. Both human and Zilani authorities were offering substantial rewards for information about their whereabouts, and the descriptions were accurate enough to make identification likely. If they were spotted by the wrong people, Jake stood and began pacing the tiny space, trying to work out who could have orchestrated such a complex deception. The false intelligence was too detailed and too well coordinated to be an accident, which meant someone with access to both human and Zilani communication systems was working to keep them isolated and vulnerable. The revelation forced both of them to finally admit their real identities to each other. Jake told Lyra that he was Sergeant Jake Morrison of the Terran Defense Corps, assigned to special operations behind enemy lines. He had been returning from a classified mission when the Vex attacked his transport. Lyra took a deep breath and revealed that she was Princess Lyra, eldest daughter of Emperor Thane and heir to the Zilani throne. She had been traveling in secret to meet with potential allies when the attacks began, and her supposed capture by humans would give her father justification for abandoning any peace negotiations. Instead of being angry about the deception, both felt relief at finally being honest with each other. Jake understood why Lyra carried herself with such authority and possessed advanced technology, while Lyra realized that Jake's tactical knowledge and leadership instincts came from his military training and combat experience. Their new honesty also brought new problems. As a human soldier and a Zilani princess, their growing relationship could be seen as treason by both their peoples. If they were discovered together, it would be assumed that one had corrupted or coerced the other, regardless of the truth of their feelings. Jake suggested that they needed to find a way off the station before their false capture stories spread further and made their situation impossible. Lyra agreed but pointed out that they also had an opportunity to strike back at whoever was manipulating the intelligence networks and trying to destroy human-Zilani relations she had been monitoring. Vex communications through her datapad and had discovered that the enemy ships docked at Kepler 7 were not just hunting refugees. They were part of a larger operation to capture key military and political figures from multiple species and use them to spread disinformation and chaos. Jake realized that they were dealing with more than just random Vex raiders. This was a coordinated psychological warfare campaign designed to prevent the various species from working together against the expanding Vex empire. By keeping potential allies suspicious and hostile toward each other, the Vex could conquer them one at a time. The discovery gave them a new purpose beyond simple survival. If they could gather evidence of the Vex deception campaign and get that information to both human and Zilani authorities, they might be able to prevent the diplomatic disaster that their supposed captures were designed to create. Lyra used her technical skills to map the Vex ship configurations and identify which vessel was likely serving as the command center for the operation. Jake studied the data and began formulating a plan to infiltrate the ship and access their intelligence systems. The plan was dangerous to the point of being suicidal. They would have to leave their safe hiding place, cross the heavily guarded docking bay, board an enemy vessel, and somehow access secured military databases without being detected or killed. The chances of success were minimal, but the alternative was watching their peoples destroy each other based on lies. As they prepared for what might be their final mission together, both Jake and Lyra found themselves confronting feelings they had been trying to ignore. The forced intimacy of their shared quarters had created a bond between them that went far beyond alliance or friendship. Jake found himself memorizing every detail of Lyra's face and the way she moved when she was thinking through a complex problem. Her intelligence and courage had impressed him from the beginning, but now he was beginning to understand that his feelings for her had grown into something much deeper than respect or admiration. Lyra was experiencing similar emotions as she watched Jake plan their infiltration mission. His willingness to risk everything to protect both their peoples showed her a side of humanity that contradicted everything she had been taught. He was not the aggressive conqueror of Zilani propaganda, but a man of honor who put duty and compassion above personal safety. The single bed that had once been a source of awkward tension now seemed precious to both of them. They spent their last night on the station lying together in the narrow space, talking quietly about their hopes for the future and their fears about the mission ahead. Jake told Lyra about his dreams of seeing humans and aliens working together. to explore the galaxy and build something better than the constant wars that seemed to define interspecies relations. She shared her vision of a galaxy where different cultures could learn from each other instead of trying to dominate or destroy their neighbors. Their conversation gradually shifted from grand ideals to personal confessions. Jake admitted that meeting Lyra had changed his understanding of what was possible between their species. While she acknowledged that he had shown her aspects of humanity that she had never imagined could exist, the physical closeness that had once been forced by circumstances now felt natural and chosen. When Lyra rested her head on Jake's chest, it was not because there was nowhere else to sleep, but because she wanted to feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the warmth of his presence. Jake held her close and marveled at how perfectly she seemed to fit against him despite their different physiologies. The electrical current that ran beneath her skin no longer felt alien but familiar and comforting, like a gentle reminder of her presence even when his eyes were closed. As the station's morning cycle began, and they prepared to leave their sanctuary, both Jake and Lyra understood that they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. Their mission would either prove that cooperation between their species was possible, or it would result in their deaths and the continuation of the cycle of mistrust and conflict. The secret they now shared was not just their growing love for each other, but their belief that the galaxy could be better than the prejudices and fears that had shaped both their peoples for generations. They were willing to risk everything to prove that understanding and cooperation were possible, even if the cost was their own lives. Jake and Lyra left their small room before dawn during the shift change when station security was at its weakest. They had spent hours studying guard patterns and maintenance schedules to find a window of opportunity that would give them access to the docking bay. Without being detected by either station personnel or Vex forces, the infiltration of the Vex command ship proved easier than expected because the enemy had grown overconfident after days of successful operations. Their security focused on preventing people from leaving the station rather than stopping anyone from boarding their vessels, and Jake's military training helped him identify blind spots in their sensor coverage. Lyra's technical abilities allowed them to bypass the ship's electronic locks and access restrictions without triggering alarms. She interfaced directly with the vessel's systems through touch, her consciousness merging with the ship's computer networks in ways that amazed Jake and made him realize how much he still had to learn about her species' capabilities. They made their way through the ship's corridors using service tunnels and maintenance shafts, avoiding the crew areas where they might be discovered. The vessel was larger than it had appeared from outside, with multiple decks dedicated to intelligence gathering and communication systems that confirmed their suspicions about the scope of the Vex operation. The command center was located at the ship's heart, protected by both physical barriers and electronic countermeasures. Jake created a distraction by triggering a false emergency alert in the engineering section, drawing most of the crew away from their posts and giving Lyra access to the main intelligence database. What they discovered was worse than either had imagined. The Vex were not just spreading disinformation about captured leaders, they were actively manipulating communication networks to create false reports of atrocities committed by different species against each other. The goal was to trigger a massive interstellar war that would weaken all potential opposition to Vex expansion. Lyra worked frantically to download the evidence they needed while Jake monitored the corridors for returning crew members. The data files were enormous and heavily encrypted, requiring all of her technical skills and processing power to access and copy without leaving traces of their presence in the system. The download was almost complete when they heard footsteps approaching the command center. Jake prepared to fight their way out, but Lyra stopped him and instead used her abilities to create a feedback loop in the ship's communication system that would broadcast their stolen intelligence directly to both human and Zilani networks. The transmission took precious seconds that they did not have, and Vex security forces burst into the command center just as the data upload finished. Jake and Lyra found themselves surrounded by armed soldiers who were both confused and angry about the security breach they had just discovered. The ship's captain was a veteran, Vex commander who recognized the significance of what Jake and Lyra had accomplished. He realized that their transmission had exposed the entire deception campaign and probably doomed the Vex plans for triggered interspecies warfare. His anger was matched by grudging respect for their courage and tactical skill during their interrogation. The Vex captain expressed puzzlement about the cooperation between a human soldier and a Zilani princess. He had been taught that such partnerships were impossible because of the fundamental differences between their species, and seeing them work together challenged his assumptions about the nature of interspecies relations. Jake and Lyra were held in a secure detention cell aboard the Vex ship, while their captors decided what to do with them. The cell was even smaller than their room on Kepler-7, but this time their confinement felt different because they had chosen to be there and had accomplished their mission despite the personal cost. Their imprisonment lasted only 18 hours before combined human and Zilani forces launched a coordinated rescue operation based on the intelligence Jake and Lyra had transmitted. The attack caught the Vex completely by surprise, because it required a level of cooperation between the two species that their psychological warfare campaign was supposed to have made impossible. The rescue fleet included ships from both the Terran Defense Corps and the Zilani Imperial Navy working together under unified command. The sight of human and alien vessels fighting side by side was unprecedented and proved that the cooperation Jake and Lyra had demonstrated was possible on a larger scale. Jake and Lyra were recovered during the battle and found themselves hailed as heroes by both species for their role in exposing the Vex deception campaign. However, their relationship remained controversial among traditionalists on both sides who believed that personal connections between humans and aliens were dangerous or unnatural. The intelligence they had gathered led to the discovery of similar Vex operations throughout the galaxy, and joint human-Zilani task forces were formed to counter these threats. Jake and Lyra were assigned to lead one of these task forces, giving them an official reason to continue working together. Their new assignment provided them with proper separate quarters for the first time since they had met, but both discovered that they missed the intimacy and closeness of their shared room on Kepler-7. The forced proximity that had once seemed like a hardship now felt like a precious memory of the time when they had learned to trust and care for each other. Jake found himself visiting Lyra's quarters frequently under the pretense of discussing mission planning and tactical coordination. She welcomed these visits and often extended them by preparing meals using ingredients from both their cultures, creating fusion dishes that neither had imagined could exist. Their professional partnership gradually evolved into something more personal and acknowledged. Other members of their task force began to notice the way they anticipated each other's thoughts and worked together with an efficiency that went beyond military training or cultural understanding. The success of their joint operations against Vex forces helped to normalize the idea of human-alien cooperation throughout both their species. Younger generations on both sides began to see their partnership as proof that the old prejudices and fears were not insurmountable barriers to friendship and collaboration. Jake and Lyra eventually became unofficial ambassadors between their peoples, helping to negotiate trade agreements and cultural exchange programs that would have been impossible before their meeting. Their relationship had evolved from reluctant cohabitation to chosen partnership to something that neither had words to describe fully. The small maintenance room on Kepler-7 had been converted back to its original purpose, but sometimes Jake and Lyra would visit the station during their travels and stand in the corridor where their unlikely alliance